Welcome to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Boykin, and I am here in wet, lockdown Boulder Creek, California. I am very, very happy today to be introducing for the first time on Slow News Day the brilliant and intrepid and incredibly thorough Vanessa Beeley. How are you this morning? It is great to see. Or it's not.
No, it's around 7 o'clock here on a sunny, balmy afternoon just before curfew in Syria, Damascus.
When I was trying to set up this interview with you, I found out, which I did not know, and I'm fairly certain this isn't exactly common knowledge, but you have routine power outages, blackouts in Syria every day.
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is a result of American unilateral sanctions, or American allied sanctions, and the US occupation of the oil fields in the northeast of Syria via various proxy agencies, either ISIS or the SDF. Effectively, I mean, the occupation of the oil fields is not because America needs the oil. They just don't want Syria to have the oil or the gas resources to enable them to provide infrastructure and services to their people. So what happens is that particularly through the winter, we're often on, for example, 2 hours on, 4 hours off. That will be maintained for maybe a month, then we'll go to 3 on, 3 off. And so this regular kind of electricity outage, in fact, about half an hour after we finish our interview tonight, it'll go off for 2 hours. Now I'm quite good. Now I'm on 4 hours on and 2 hours off. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the elements of sanctions that people are utterly unaware of. And I think when we talked about it, you quite rightly said this is a kind of psychological warfare. You know, and it is. I mean, I'm lucky. I'm relatively lucky. I'm in the suburbs of Damascus. The closer you get into Damascus center, the slightly better it gets. But if you get out into the rural areas, quite often in the winter, they'll have 1 hour electricity per day.
Wow. That and it is. I mean, it sounds. You know, it sounds like a psyop to me. It does.
Yeah.
Like,
of course it is. I mean, that's what sanctions are. I mean, sanctions are, you know, they're always claimed to be targeting some kind of, in inverted quote unquote, tyrannical regime. But of course they don't. What they do is to tenderize the people of the nation, the poorest people of the nations. They affect the health infrastructure, the agricultural infrastructure, the educational infrastructure, every single possible essential infrastructure for the civilian population. And Syria is no different, except that this war has been going on for 10 years now. So twice the length of the Second World War. I mean, if you want to put it into some kind of perspective. And during that time, right from the beginning of the conflict, the American coalition proxies have effectively occupied areas which contain water resources, gas resources, and oil resources in order to starve the Syrian civilian population under the protection of the Syrian government and the Syrian army and allies of all those essential items. And that's been the ongoing pattern. And not only have they occupied it, of course, they've destroyed it. Many of the electrical power stations that were taken over by the terrorist groups dominated by Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, were then destroyed as those terrorists left. A recent thermal power plant in northern Hama on the border with Idlib has just been destroyed. It was demolished. They just put explosives underneath it and brought it down. So that's the intention. It's not to steal the oil. The oil provides revenue for the various proxies. So that means that the US doesn't have to pay them. That's a great scheme for the US. But their main agenda here is to prevent Syria having any of its own resources.
That's gross. And there's plenty of cover being ran, or I guess consent being manufactured by the White+Helmets. And I'm pulling up the article that you have in RT White+Helmets use COVID-19 crisis to further U.S. coalition regime change agenda in Syria. If you want to walk us through that just a little bit, because most of the people in the chat, I think, and me as well, know what we know about the White+Helmets because of you.
Well, I mean, as you all probably know, then the White+Helmets are basically an Al-Qaeda or an associated extremist group affiliate. They move with the armed extremist groups. Whenever areas are liberated, the White+Helmets rarely stay behind and take amnesty and reconciliation from the Syrian government. They move with those extremist groups to the new front lines, and there they provide media cover for those groups. They provide the humanitarian cloak of invisibility under which those terrorist groups operate and commit atrocities against the Syrian people in their neighborhood, including on the borders and in the actual occupied areas. And so what we saw when the COVID-19 hype started, when the hysteria started, we saw immediately, as if they had something prepared earlier, the White+Helmets dressed in pristine PPE, in these pristine kind of, white suits and masks, and carrying their bags, and it provided them with another perfect PR opportunity. Here are the White+Helmets providing sanitization, providing health programs for the refugees that have been driven out of their homes and displaced by the tyrannical Syrian quote-unquote regime. But in reality, what we have to try and put into context here is that the White+Helmets claim, and this is underpinning their self-promotion and, of course, the kind of industrial PR complex that runs their promotional and publicity material. What they promote themselves as is a humanitarian organization without any political affiliation. Yet what we saw at the beginning of COVID-19 was Raed Saleh, the head of the White+Helmets, basically informing Senate what talking points they should adopt in Idlib, right? And calling for further sanctions, for doubling down on maximum pressure against the Syrian government at a time when effectively, according to the media and governmental hype, we were entering a pandemic. We were entering a time of humanitarian emergency. And yet here was this humanitarian, non-governmental, quote-unquote, organization demanding that sanctions be increased on the Syrian people, effectively. As I've just explained, sanctions are never against the government, they're always against the people, and there is no difference inside Syria. And here we have the White+Helmets demanding that sanctions be increased against the Syrian people, and yet these are supposed to be representing Syrian people. They're supposed to be representing the humanitarian aspects of the US coalition campaign. But I mean, we know that this entire humanitarian pretext for war is a fig leaf behind which the US coalition, the imperialist nations, hide their military adventurism and their capitalist plundering of these countries.
And it's not just the US, it's not just the UK, yeah. Or there's both proxies that we're using out of Turkey, and there's Israel's involvement, which is not even remotely touched on, at least here in the US. We have to rely on what you do and how you're reporting out of Syria in order to get even a glimpse of it. And your follow-up article to the White+Helmets providing cover, providing cover for calling for sanctions, for normalizing the war crime that is sanctions, deals with the follow-up article deals with Israel's involvement. They're using, and we knew that they were using COVID as an excuse to slaughter Palestinians, to further slaughter Palestinians, to further expand their territories, and to creep further into Lebanon. But your article says that they're hijacking Lebanese airspace in order to fire missiles right outside of where you are.
Yeah, exactly. And actually what we've seen, I mean, what we've always seen, I mean, for example, prior to the last ceasefire agreement between Turkey and Russia, and of course, Russia's negotiations will always be approved by Damascus. And that came in place in March. Now, just prior to that, Turkey actually, with its own military, not only with its proxy military that are occupying Idlib in the northwest of Syria, Turkey with its own military and its own military vehicles and equipment invaded Idlib. And I was actually in Idlib at that time. I was going into Sarakeb and Maratonum and some of the areas that had just been liberated. And at that point, there were something like 50 Turkish bases in Idlib that had been established in a space of probably a couple of weeks. And at this time, Turkey was invading with military and vehicles and arms, basically for Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda inside Syria. And at that point, exactly at that point, Israel bombed an air defense system in Homs and in Damascus. So there we saw the correlation between Turkey and Israel. But what we regularly see is the correlation between Israel, Turkey, and the United States. And right now, under cover of COVID-19, and Israel has admitted that it's using COVID-19 because it considers that Syria and its allies, Iran and Hezbollah, are going to be distracted and will be putting resources towards fighting COVID-19 or rather dealing with COVID-19. So now it's the perfect opportunity for Israel to strike while Syria, Hezbollah and Iran are vulnerable in Syria. And that's exactly what they've been doing. We've had, I think now, about 6 attacks in the last 5 weeks. And the attack, the most recent attack, killed 3 civilians in a residential area. Of course, the usual claim that this was an Iranian military area, that this was infested with Iranian troops, and that's why they targeted it, is false. And it usually is false. But in any case, even if they are targeting Iranian factions inside Syria, they are legally inside Syria. The aggression from Israel is unlawful and illegal under international law. And of course, this is never mentioned. It gets away endlessly with its self-defense claim or its justification that it's under threat from Hezbollah and Iran, who are effectively fighting terrorism that is funded and aided by Israel and the US and Turkey and all the other myriad of allies here, regional and otherwise. So yeah, what we've seen, and added to that, of course, not only Israel, but we've also seen America, which under Trump, of course, claimed they were withdrawing from Syria, but they maintained the oil fields. And Trump was probably the most blatant of all American presidents in the sense that he said, yeah, but we want the oil. You know, we've got to pay for this war somehow. So I'm keeping the oil.
Yeah, we had to find out through WikiLeaks that Neera Tanden and the Democrats spelt the same way. And there's, I mean, there's an email from Neera Tanden saying we need to get the resources here. Yeah. But Trump sidesteps that process by coming right out and being like, yeah, our foreign policy is based on the acquisition of natural resources. If that's what we do, like, and just flopping his little mushroom winky on the table and being like, we're America, you know. That's how he rolls.
We don't do things like that. No, I know. So basically, what's happening now, despite him saying we're withdrawing, we're taking all our troops out, and Pompeo getting really pissed off that he was doing that, now basically what we're seeing is a reoccupation. So astoundingly, despite the kind of US and global diktat that nobody should leave home, everybody's under house arrest, nobody can go within 2 meters of each other, social distancing, blah, blah, blah. Apparently that doesn't apply to the military, because the military is moving from Iraq and Turkey and from Jordan into Syria and reoccupying bases that they had previously vacated. I visited one of them in Ain al-Arab after America had basically fled the region. And they're carrying out attacks on a regular basis on the PMU, Hashad al-Shabi in Iraq. And basically what we've seen, of course, is a reemergence under control of the United States of ISIS. Now, America, despite its claims to be leaving Syria, had always maintained a military base in Al Tanaf, which is on the border basically with Iraq and Jordan. And beneath Al Tanaf, on the border with Jordan, there is a refugee camp, quote unquote, which is basically a military recruitment and training center for extremist groups, including ISIS. So what America is doing, it's created a 55-kilometer exclusion zone around that area. So the Syrian Arab Army and the Russians are not allowed to come into that area, not even to provide humanitarian aid to the civilians that are living under occupation of the armed groups, including ISIS, in Rukban. So what we've been seeing now, again under cover of COVID, is a number of what I describe as swarming campaigns by ISIS. They're attacking east of Homs, they're attacking in Deir ez-Zor, they're attacking close to Palmyra, and they're coming back into the Beida, into the desert area, where previously they'd carried out an attack against Swaida in the southeast of Syria in 2018. Of course, without America stopping them at all, they massacred more than 172 civilians in Swaida city and in the countryside during a dawn raid. Now, that raid must have happened under American surveillance. There is absolutely no way that America's sophisticated surveillance apparatus did not spot ISIS fighters moving across the desert during the night and entering those villages to massacre more than 172 civilians and to wound and injure many more, and kidnap actually around 30 for around 6 months. So we know for a fact here that ISIS is nothing more than another proxy of America. And of course, what we're seeing now is this kind of re-emergence. We're seeing America airlifting ISIS fighters from prisons in northeast Syria, taking them into Iraq, where basically they're being retrained and re-equipped before they're re-percolated back into Syria. And we knew this was going to happen. You know, this happened the minute. Yeah, sorry.
No, this is happening obviously with the full cooperation of the Jordanian government too, yeah?
The Jordanian government, certainly a lot of the arms and equipment is still coming in from Jordan. I had that confirmed fairly recently. And certainly there wouldn't be anywhere else that it could come in from. And from the beginning of the conflict, the borders with Jordan have been used by the armed groups to bring weapons and equipment in, as of course the borders with the territory that is occupied by Israel in Jolan also. Israel was providing medical aid. I actually visited an area right on the border fence, which was actually where the White+Helmets escaped through when they were evacuated out of Syria by Israel and taken into Jordan. I actually went to that area and saw a hospital that had been established by Israel with Israeli products, with Israeli medicine strewn on the ground. And that was purely for the terrorist groups that were fighting there. And Israel has admitted itself that it has armed those extremist sectarian groups that have occupied at least the south of Syria, but it's been providing arms into those extremist groups from the beginning of the conflict. You
write a lot about hybrid warfare. I'll hold the question that I was going to ask for a little bit. You write a lot about hybrid warfare. Can you explain to the folks at home, as it were, what you mean by that and how it's deployed throughout not just Syria, but the entire region going all the way down to Yemen? And we'll use that as a way to transition into your article about Yemen.
Yeah. Well, basically, hybrid warfare is a sort of covert, clandestine warfare. What I've focused on since I started investigating the White+Helmets, and I would recommend everyone to read the work of one of my dear colleagues, Corey Morningstar, The Wrong Kind of Green. And she's done absolutely like the most outstanding work on the NGO complex, on the non-governmental complex, the smart power complex, soft power complex, whatever you want to call it. But basically, for me, the absolute key to the hybrid warfare strategy, which is fundamentally anything that is not direct military conflict. So hybrid war strategy can be anything that pressurizes or turns the screws on a target nation, on a prey nation. Often this is done through the smart power complex, through the non-governmental organizations, as in fact the White+Helmets, although I would dispute the fact that it's a non-governmental organization, as it's funded by the majority of the governments that are funding the terrorist groups inside Syria. And it has a clear political agenda. But there are a number of other, if not hundreds, of NGOs operating inside Syria. Now, these work under this kind of humanitarian banner. They work as ostensibly medical, charitable organizations. But in reality, what they're doing is they're infiltrating that country. They're pinpointing the weak points that can be exploited by the imperialist nations in their drive to subjugate and to destabilize that country. Sanctions are part of the hybrid war strategy because, again, it's not direct military confrontation. It's economic terrorism, actually, for want of a better word. And then, of course, you have the use of, for example, the UN agencies that are nothing more than outreach agents for the US coalition for the military-industrial complex in these various intervention programs globally. The UN acts as an agency often to impose the sanctions, to ensure that they are maintained in favor of the aggressor nations that are always, of course, the favored allies of the US and the UK, etc. And so the hybrid war strategy is probably one of the most insidious. I mean, for example, I think it was March this year, there was actually an SAS operative who was injured in southern Syria, and he was flown from southern Syria somehow into Al Tanf and then was taken to Jordan for treatment. So for me, the hybrid war strategy is anything that is not direct military confrontation. It's everything that is clandestine, everything that is below the surface that the majority of the public don't know about, or they don't associate with war. You know, the sanctions are sold as being necessary to bring these recalcitrant regimes into line. But people don't understand or maybe appreciate the devastating effects. As I called it economic terrorism. Actually, it's economic savagery. Yeah. You know, because it kills people. It's way more brutal than a military war, trust me. Well, you know,
when the UN is the I guess bully that people use, or the White+Helmets or the UN is the front that's being used to do this, it gives people in the West the wrong impression that, well, if the UN is the arbiter of this, you know, maybe it's for a good reason. For example, the UN trying to put pressure on the Yemenis to move their central bank to a town that is entirely controlled by the West and by Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. I mean, I think I don't think any country, except maybe Iraq, of course, but I think since Iraq, I think Yemen is the country that most exemplifies the weaponization of the UN and its associated agencies. If we look at how the war in Yemen began and how it has been sustained, the UN is instrumental in that. Effectively, back in March 2015, and Jamal Ben Omar, who then was the UN peace envoy, he stated publicly, he said, I do not understand why Saudi Arabia has begun this aggression just as a Yemeni coalition government was being constitutionally formed that would incorporate all of the major political parties inside Yemen, and it was being politically resolved. The situation was being politically resolved very positively for Yemen and for the Yemeni people. And at that point, Saudi started its aggression. And from that point on, the UN introduced Resolution 2216, which is still in place now, 5 years into the war. UN Resolution 2216 was originally against five named individuals. But that resolution, which is based upon the legitimacy of President Mansour Hadi, who in fact resigned his post twice, fled to Aden in the south, and then fled to Riyadh, where he demanded that Saudi Arabia bomb the people that he had been president over for 3 years, 1 year beyond his actual GCC mandate. And he hadn't achieved any of the agenda that was set out for him under that mandate. So he resigned, basically. But he is still considered under Resolution 2216 the legitimate president of Yemen. And on that basis, they are putting the sanctions on five named individuals, which have then been expanded to cover 27 million Yemenis. Right, so that's number one. So Resolution 2216, which is couched in illegitimacy anyway, is what is used by the Saudi coalition of aggression to effectively blockade 27 million Yemenis on a humanitarian food aid basis. As you mentioned, the UN was instrumental in the moving of the Yemeni National Bank from Sana'a, the capital, to Aden, which is under the control of Saudi Arabia and its terrorist proxies, the UAE, the British, and America. And so basically they deprived Yemenis of, I think it's around 15 billion of government budget for wages. So since that date, since 2016, thanks to the UN, the majority of Yemenis have been without their salaries, which up to that point were being paid by the coalition government that has been put in place constitutionally in Yemen, but is still not recognized by the UN. You can see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
25 to 60% of any UN contributions to humanitarian aid in Yemen, I've been told by the Yemeni health minister, actually go to the operating, they go for operating expenses to the agencies that are taking that money to distribute it. And the majority of that money doesn't even reach the Yemeni people that are living, which is the majority, under the control of the Salvation Government, which is the coalition government, which represents 38 of the political parties inside Yemen. And this is very similar to what happens in Syria. All of the aid, of course, that comes in only comes into areas that are occupied by the terrorist groups. It doesn't come into any of the areas, which is 85% of Syria, which is now back under the control and protection of the Syrian government. Right? Yemen is exactly the same situation. And the UN has imposed what it calls its verification mechanism, which means it holds up this humanitarian aid in the various ports for a huge amount of time to make sure it doesn't have weapons. So by the time this aid reaches any Yemenis, the food is perished, nothing is edible, nothing is usable, none of the medicines that they've asked for are able to be used. The Yemeni health minister put in a proposal for health aid, and to date, only 19% of that proposal has been implemented by the UN. And of course, what the UN does also, it has to act as a PR agency for those that are paying its bills. We know when it tries to step out of line, either Israel or Saudi Arabia, we know Saudi Arabia put a financial fatwa on the UN when it tried to say, oh, they're committing crimes in Yemen. No, you don't say things like that because we withdraw our funding. It's exactly the same thing as with Israel. It's no different. The UN is a slave to its paymaster, and that's what it comes down to. It's no longer an arbiter of peace. It's an arbiter. It's a inflictor of war. It's an inflictor of misery. It's a bringer of poverty and the most abject misery you can possibly imagine. And in Yemen, its role has been criminal. I would say even more criminal than its role previously in Iraq, where it enabled the death of 500,000 children through economic terrorism, through the sanctions. They were imposed by the UN.
And it's so weird because in the Assange movement, we rely fairly heavily on the weight of the words of UN Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer. But he seems to be one of the few people in the entire UN that aren't like 100% sucked into, I don't know, the death cult that they seem to be a part of in the Middle East. I don't know if that's because he's not directly involved with policy implementation in the Middle East, or if the office of the Special Rapporteur on Torture gives you a different perspective, but he's got to be going, I hate the organization that I work for. I really, that was ancillary. At any rate, it's a conflict.
I think where you're right there is, I mean, if we take, for example, the recent OPCW exposure, the alleged chemical attack in Douma in Eastern Ghouta in Damascus, and I was actually in Damascus at that time. I visited Douma. I was convinced within minutes of arriving there had been no chemical attack, as were many other journalists and experts. But of course, now what you have are the expert and analysts within the OPCW itself, which of course is effectively a UN-affiliated agency, now able to determine who is responsible for chemical attacks. So it has even greater power than it had before, when of course it could only determine if there had been a chemical attack. We now know it to be entirely corrupt. We know that it has basically manipulated the facts in order to posthumously justify the US, UK, and French aggression against Syria. We know that basically it made up evidence. There's no other way of saying it. And at the same time, it's covering up the crime. Who killed the children that were used in the propaganda to promote the idea of a chemical attack? Were the White+Helmets responsible for the death of those children? Why is there no investigation into that? And of course, we ask these questions rhetorically because we know why. But the fact is that there are members of the OPCW who've come forward. There are very brave analysts and experts who've really risked their lives and risked everything to come forward and say, we don't agree with this. They don't have a political reason for doing so. They don't have a financial reason for doing so. They have integrity and they have principles. So I guess that's part of my last shreds of optimism. There are still people like that, who are prepared to come forward and who are prepared to err on the side of principle and justice and their own integrity.
And we had 4 separate WikiLeaks drops on the OPCW starting in, I believe, October of last year, going through December. And then just last week, more information came out through Aaron Mate and the Gray Zone that just corroborated everything that was said in WikiLeaks, but also further exposed the heavy hand that the U.S. State Department played in selling a narrative and more than likely helping facilitate a false flag that was then used to slaughter innocent civilians. What do we got here? Oh yeah. Circle back to Yemen for a minute. This is just one page of my notes I've got. It's even more scribbly when Whitney was on yesterday. I had like 3 pages, and my 7-year-old got a hold of the notebook, so I had to wake up at about 5 o'clock in the morning yesterday and just scribble them all down again. Okay, so I'm going to set it up by saying that here in the U.S., what we know about Yemen in terms of what's happening and how bad it is mostly through like watered down outlets like Jacobin, who serve to prop up the quote unquote progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna tried to get a resolution through Congress saying, we're going to end the war in Yemen. And there was an asterisk by it and said, unless we suspect any, terrorist organization to be operating in there, and we're going to umbrella every organization that we're currently funding as part of Al-Qaeda, and then we get to go back into Yemen and blow them up. But China's role in Yemen is really, it's one of those things that I'm glad you write about, because at least here, either you hate China or the Chinese are setting the example for how everyone is supposed to live. You know, there are very, very few outlets that look both critically at U.S. foreign policy and China's foreign policy as both incredibly heavy-handed and empirical. This being one of them, you know, because I've got eyeballs and I can think on my own. But I really liked the way that you laid it out in the article that you had where you interviewed the health minister, I believe. The
health minister and the Yemeni ambassador to Damascus. He was the one that spoke about China and Israel's role and China's role. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's explore that for a little bit, if we could.
Well, China basically. I mean, there has been a sort of sea change from China as regards Yemen fairly recently. They are in negotiation or in talks with the Yemeni health minister to provide genuine economic aid and help for the medical sector in Yemen, which of course has been decimated by the Saudi bombing and aggression. Very few of the hospitals are still operational, and of course most of them are deprived of equipment and resources. So China has stepped up. Now, prior to that, China, when I looked into it, China had actually been previously supplying drones in competition with the US to Saudi Arabia. Now, when I spoke to someone here at the embassy, at the Chinese embassy, they basically said, yeah, you know, that was previously. We hadn't actually supplied some for some time, etc. Those were old stocks. Okay. But what was interesting is what the Yemeni ambassador said to me. He said, look, I think what's happened is China has seen that America is upping the ante against China. You know, we've seen the protests in Hong Kong, which we know to be funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, etc., NED, and to be backed basically, as always, by CIA outreach agents, the usual color revolution kind of shtick, right? We know that there's been an uptick in the humanitarian rhetoric led by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and all the usual kind of revolving door deep state organizations, you know, that are always there to manufacture consent for war, whether it's hybrid war or direct military confrontation. But I think, as I said, these days you're going to see less and less direct military confrontation because America isn't stupid enough to take on the likes of Iran, China, Russia head on. It's just never going to do this. So we're going to see more and more of this hybrid war strategy. We're going to see more and more of the media demonization of these nations. We're perhaps even going to see more bio-warfare, more techno-warfare, all of the things that actually Whitney was talking about, of course, also, you know, the whole DARPA projects and all of that kind of terrifying stuff that she goes into.
Oh, man, it's so wild.
I know, I'm like these gene mutating drugs. I'm just like, oh God.
So I experience every live stream in a sort of a blackout. Like if you asked me what I said 10 minutes after we're off camera, I'll be like, I don't fucking know.
I don't know.
And I'm kind of thankful for that because I'm certain I would have nightmares after speaking with Whitney as often as I do. She kind of tipped, well, I don't know if she tipped her hand or if she was just letting people know what was coming down the pike. But as we were closing yesterday, she mentioned something about as I look further into this, I'm starting to notice that there may be a in the dark partnership between China and the US that will result in sort of a dual power, one world government type thing. So I'm very interested in where she's going with that and like how to get a look at it. Do you ever just want to call up Eva Bartlett and be like, we're the only two sane white people here, let's go get drunk together?
Yeah, frequently.
All right.
If it wasn't for curfew, we would. But yeah, I mean, if we look at, as I was talking about, the humanitarian rhetoric that's coming up about the atrocities committed against the Uyghurs. Of course, what people ignore in this fact is the number of Uyghur terrorists that are in Idlib massacring civilians, right?
Yeah.
And actually the programs, the de-radicalization programs that China has in that province to try and, as I said, to de-radicalize these extremist factions. But of course, what we also need to look at is the geographical location of the I've forgotten the name of the province now, where the Uyghurs are, but it's basically the Silk Road. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Silk Road project, or the 5 Cs project, is one of the reasons that Assad was targeted. Not only the fact that he wouldn't abandon Palestine, he wouldn't abandon Hezbollah, he wouldn't agree to the American-backed Qatari-Turkish pipeline. He preferred the Iranian, Russian-backed pipeline. You know, how dare he? How dare he actually take independent decisions for a sovereign nation? Damn it, you know, especially one on the doorstep with Israel. He was allied with Iran. He wouldn't drop that. You know, there were many reasons, but one of them in particular was the partnership, or the projected partnership, the Silk Road, the Belt Road Initiative with China. And that was a huge threat to US global supremacy, because that would cut the US out of the deal. That would mean that Syria basically would be the hub for Chinese trade into Europe, etc. You know, I mean, that's the thing. America was just facing doom at this point.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. You know, due to Syria.
And people forget, or people aren't necessarily aware of, that the Uyghurs are a Wahhabist sect. Yeah. And so when people in the U.S. talk about, oh, the Chinese are being so cruel to the poor, innocent Uyghur Muslims, they're not catching that this is the same ideology that comes out of Islam that supposedly all the bad guys have. And like, it's just one way to either kick around China, or one way to, I guess, play to Chinese sympathies if you're like riding out of the gray zone or something like that. Mm-hmm. And Ben Norton in particular, like, will provide so much cover for whatever the Chinese are doing. It's kind of odd to me. It is. But I mean, that's just observation. I haven't spoken to Ben Norton. I'm not trying to like kick him around or anything. He does good work. But man, he really kind of lays down some cover there. If we could, because we've got about 20 minutes left. Yeah. Could we move to your recent work on the UK and who is behind the COVID response there? And I'll preface it with this. When I was speaking to Whitney yesterday, she was like, look, from the Epstein series to what I've written on Unit 8200 to this Dark Winter series I'm exploring, and everything that's going on with DARPA, it feels like I'm writing the same story. And there's just different angles of approach for the same story. And it turns out that the COVID response in the West, specifically in the Five Eyes countries, is almost the same story. There's just a couple of different players.
For sure. And I agree. I mean, I was talking to Whitney on message yesterday about, you know, the various things that we were going to be collaborating on in the next couple of weeks.
And I can't wait for that.
And yeah, I mean, you know, I love working with Whitney. It's a really great partnership. We just feed off each other, and you know, it really works well. But I think, I mean, I agree. I think what we're actually seeing is our own governments deploying the hybrid war strategy against us. You know, if we look at what's happening in the UK, I mean, I'm more informed, obviously, on what's going on in the UK, but I think it pretty much mirrors what's going on in the US. You know, you have the fact that people are basically under house arrest. They're being forced into a position where they're more dependent on the state. So effectively what we have now is a kind of feudal capitalist state, creating this codependency among probably 60% of its population, financially and the creation of what I call this kind of healthcare tyranny that's coming into being right now. You know, we're having our self-determination from a medical perspective completely stripped away from us. I mean, the threat of immunity passports, of contact tracing, of mandatory vaccines is a very, very real threat right now. And this is scary because then you get into the DARPA stuff. Then you get into what Whitney's been talking about. You know, the gene altering drugs, the surveillance drugs, the ID 2020, the biometric identification elements are coming in, and suddenly this is 1984. This is like Aldous Huxley on steroids, right? Yeah. And you know, I was talking to another good friend of mine today, Mike Robinson of UK Column News, and I highly recommend everyone following them. They've done some fantastic work, especially yesterday's news program. Please watch it, because it's astounding what they picked up. I mean, Britain has been the world expert and exporter, actually, of behavioral insight, of the ability to socially engineer entire campaigns. I mean, I always say in Syria, the intelligence campaign is not being waged by America, it's being waged by Britain. It's being funded by America, and it's being kind of overarched by America with the muscle and the brawn and the military equipment and so on. But it's Britain that is always the intelligence mastermind behind everything. And it is exactly that's happening now in the UK. You know, we have behavioral insights organizations that are nudging the public in the direction that the government wants it to go in. And of course, what we see is, I mean, particularly what I focused on are who actually was engineering the British government response to COVID-19. You know, why did we go from like zero to this unbelievable kind of house arrest, social distancing? I mean, to be honest, I had about a week where my jaw just dropped, and I was like, how the hell did that happen so fast, you know? And even people who'd been on the same side with me in Syria, who'd always been, you know, in solidarity with anti-imperialist projects, with genuine anti-war activism, suddenly split away. Suddenly I was the weirdo. I was the conspiracy theorist. I was the murderer who was bringing about the death of everyone because I was saying, no, you know, we shouldn't lock down. This is insane.
I had two friends yesterday that say in different parts of the country, tell me that they had been accused of attempted murder because they got out of their car in a parking lot and their mask wasn't on. And then I see a post on Facebook like 10 minutes later. Can we call the cops on people who aren't wearing? And I'm like, do you not see what's happening here? Like I always say that we don't have governments that run intelligence agencies. We have intelligence agencies that run governments. And what we have here is the implementation of like the global Stasi, where your neighbors are being given snitch apps, and like they're being told it by state governors, by celebrities on TV, by everyone with a blue check on Twitter. Like this is the new normal now. You're the new normal means you have to, you know, I love in France how you have to wear a mask, but they still ban the burqa. We live in a fucking cartoon.
Actually, that's a really interesting point, because a Yemeni friend of mine, he said to me, you know, all I can think about when I see everyone in these masks is Wahhabism. He said, everyone's just suddenly gone to the veil.
Yep.
He said, this is unbelievable. Like all these years they've been fighting against this terrorism. Now everyone is basically covering up.
Yeah. All the time I say that we live in a fucking cartoon, and every day there's just reason after reason after reason that makes me go, oh my God, fucking right. We have a question in the chat. What do you think of George Galloway?
Oh.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
I've got mixed opinions on this too. I do.
Right. Well, look, dear old George, you know, I mean, the thing is with George Galloway, he's an opportunist. I'm going to put it out there. He's an opportunist. He changes his mind when public consensus goes his way, right? So I think what we saw was in the beginning, many erstwhile colleagues and many people who'd been on, you know, his platform, whether it was with Sputnik or various others that he does, were a little bit surprised at his vehement protectionism of a government narrative. I mean, what I actually find slightly amusing now is that Tony+Blair has come onto the scene. You know, Tony+Blair Institute has come on as the global expert that is going to be advising on the pandemic recovery. So my comment is, so right, how does that sit with George Galloway like right now, you know? So I think, coming back to a more serious point, I think every one of us who would genuinely, look, I would like nothing better than to be wrong about what I'm saying about COVID-19 and what I think is our future and what I think the governments are trying to do to us. I would love to be wrong. I don't go into this to be right. I don't go into this to be a big guy or to be anything. There's nothing ego-based in this. I'm just going into it because I'm actually, initially when it all started, I was a bit scared. I was like, what the hell is going on? Yeah. So you start to look into it. You start to investigate. That's my job, right? I don't put stuff out there that's sensationalist or is not researched or is not evidenced, ever. I try not to. I'm not saying I won't make mistakes. We all do. But everything I do is from a genuine base. And so when I basically challenged Galloway on Twitter and I said to him, look, I'm a little bit disappointed and saddened that you're taking this stance, that you're basically attacking people like me, that you should know by now, you know, we're not here for any agenda. We're not here for any sort of self-aggrandizement. We're here simply to try and research what the hell is going on. Block. And I mean, he pretty much blanket blocked anyone who challenged the official narrative.
On his show a couple of months ago. He did. It was a great interview, too. It was. Like, and they had a lovely conversation, and I think he preemptively blocked Patrick.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was the most bizarre thing. But then, you know, when I look at the history, then maybe it's not so bizarre. And I've noticed now, I mean, I was talking with Eva Bartlett yesterday, and I think she's kind of digging a little bit deeper into what he's been saying and, you know, and how much he's changed. And of course, now he is, which is a fairly typical pattern with Galloway. He's now backtracking a little bit and starting to kind of, you know, add in a few bits that we were all saying right from the beginning. So we'll probably see him, you know, flip-flop back our way again at some point. But
I think so here's the thing, and I think this may be what drove it, because right before this broke, he started the Workers' Party, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're the face of the Workers' Party, and it's the workers who are being hardest hit by all of this, you're probably going to over-pander to protect in your mind what is protecting the base of your political party. And this isn't something where, look, if you're not already in a position of real or perceived power, what you ultimately think about this isn't going to help drive the response. You know, in my mind, this is a live fire exercise.
Yeah.
And there are not just going to be COVID related casualties. This is going to be the precursor to rounding up dissidents.
Yeah, absolutely. And
the extradition of Julian Assange is pivotal in this. If we can stop that, we may be able to stop the dissident roundup as a result. But if he's used as an example and the precedent is set that anyone who publishes writes about anything that doesn't, go along with the official narrative is subject to any country's version of the Espionage Act, we're fucked. And
well, I mean, we're seeing it come into play right now, right? I mean, the YouTube censorship, the Facebook censorship, the Vimeo censorship. I mean, Judy Mikovitz's video, the two doctors, Dr. Erickson's, every time I tried to upload that onto any platform, it was removed seconds after it went up. And YouTube CEO has already said they're removing anything which doesn't comply with the WHO diktat. But the problem is that the WHO diktat keeps changing also. They keep switching. So, I mean, this is absolute. But if people cannot see, let's get one thing straight. Okay, there is a virus. People are dying, but they're not dying in greater numbers than under any other flu epidemic that we've had. I mean, in fact, the numbers are lower. And there's no spike coming unless, of course, they manufacture one. What we're actually seeing now in almost every country is a flattening off, is a dropping of the numbers, is an end of the epidemic, right? I mean, we're seeing that almost universally, country to country, lockdown or no lockdown. Because funnily enough, we're coming out of the flu season, we're coming into the end of the flu season, we're coming into the hot weather, etc., etc. I mean, take Syria, for example. We've had less than 50 cases here. We've had 3 deaths. I mean, that's actually a pretty good season for, for a country that's 10 years at war, under sanctions, still being targeted by Israel, America, and the various terrorist proxy groups, right? So fundamentally, I'm not downplaying any of the deaths, but let's face the fact that probably the majority of these deaths are in care homes of the elderly that have been abandoned and isolated and left without and neglected, unable to get into hospital, forced to sign DNR notices so they won't be resuscitated anyway, even if they are taken into hospital, right? And for me, this is what people should be outraged about, not calling me a murderer, because I'm pointing out the nefarious activity of my government that's driving, or agencies that are driving my government response to COVID-19, and the absolutely horrifying effect, 1.6 million benefit claims in a 2-week period in the UK, right? 50% of the world workforce is likely to be left without a livelihood. Millions of children thrown into poverty. In Britain, we already had sort of pre-Victorian poverty levels for children, right, in 2019. It had increased from 2012. God knows what it will be now. Now we have the authoritarian measures coming into schools. I mean, have you seen the recent schools reopening and the kids having to stay 2 meters apart, and in like painted squares, they're playing in squares, they're not allowed to touch each other? I mean, if people cannot see the absolute insanity of this response in contrast to the actual severity of it, and the number of experts, epidemiologists and experts and doctors, medical experts, scientific analysts, all of whom are saying this is not a pandemic. We should not be on lockdown. We should not be responding in this way. And every single one of them is being censored. Why? If our government were genuine in trying to put forward a positive response to COVID-19, why wouldn't they take into account conflicting opinions? Why are they only relying upon a scientific clique that are providing them with the information they want, like Nial+Ferguson, Imperial College, funded by Gates, funded by various global immunization organizations like Wellcome Trust, like Gates, like SAPI, like Gavi, etc., right? And Ferguson, whose own model was so archaic. I mean, there's now I'm not a computer expert by any means, but I've had people contact me saying, look, we've managed to basically to look at the how do I even say it? To look at the actual model that he used, and it's ancient. It's no longer relevant. It's not even, and he has a failure. He has 100% failure record. 2001, foot and mouth disease, failed. 12 million animals killed. Swine flu, failed. Avian flu, failed. Mad cow disease, failed. You know, he was predicting tens of thousands of deaths, maybe a few hundred, you know, in each case. So the guy is a failure. He's an abject failure. And yet on his model, right, the government went to war against its people. So effectively, and then, of course, he walked away from the SAGE team because he was caught with his lover, assuming that he had immunity because he'd had COVID-19. So he just blew the entire the Gates argument out of the water, right? So, you know, and Chris Whitty, who's the chief medical officer, he has publicly said, effectively, COVID-19 is not much, really. It's not killing many people. So they're putting the information out there. But people are in such a kind of abusive victim state of mind, Stockholm syndrome, whatever you want to call it. They've been gaslighted for so many years. They're not questioning. They're not challenging. Even members of my own family, sadly. You know, they're not challenging. They're not confronting. And they're allowing these it's savagery. It's a government turning on its own people. It's doing to its own people exactly what it's done globally. And if these governments can commit genocide against, quote unquote, the brown people, what makes you think they're going to care about their own little people? They don't. They don't. And people need to get that into their heads. None of these organizations give a shit about us. They would far rather the elderly died because then they don't have to pay out the pensions. They'd far rather that the poverty-stricken go further into poverty so that they can just be completely discarded. You know, again, Cory Morningstar has written extensively about this, that it's an attack on the working class. It's an attack on the, you know, on the little people, as I call them. I mean, I've followed the Gilets jaunes protests in France since they began. I was in France when they began. I attended them. You know, and this was classic plutocrats, totalitarian state against 60% of the population, which are the little people. They're the dispensable people. They're the people they don't care about. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. And people are ignoring this fact, you know?
They're the people who can be kept for the bare minimum in terms of governmental services or emergency aid that is basically an advance on a tax return that comes next year. We're fronting ourselves money right now. And when you're held like that, the concept of what freedom is or what liberty is not something that you get to define through experience. It's something that is propagandized into you from birth. And breaking out of that cycle, well, I mean, it's what you help people do in your work. It's what we try to do here on the show. But it's an uphill fucking battle, you know? I do think with what's happening with the response to COVID, the severity of it, how many times health officials slip up and let people know what's really happening, or how many times they slip up and tell you what's going to happen. Like a guy down in Ventura County, California, who said, you know, here's what we're going to do. And we're going to round up people and we're going to take them out of their homes and we're going to blockade. And he goes, now there's some people who might be into the Constitution or constitutional rights. So we may experience a little bit of pushback. And then he goes right on to a completely different subject. Now, he did get called out on that a little bit later and tried to walk it back. But the fact that he said the quiet part out loud, that people who, you know, we have a constitution in the country, we're supposed to be adhering to it. And for that to be described by someone who's dictating what becomes law. He's an unelected official. He's a health official. Nobody, you know, put him in that position to decide our fate as into constitutional rights. Like we're decorating, you know, and it's a nice color couch. I'm into this couch. I am. It'll look good in my living room here. Like constitutional rights are something that could be treated that way. That's saying the quiet part out loud to me. I really can't thank you enough for being on the show today. It has been a wonderful conversation. I learned some stuff. I hope they learned some stuff. And yeah, please come back.
I would love to.
And let everybody know where they can find your work and where they can find you on social media.
Vanessa Beeley, Twitter, Vanessa Beeley on Patreon, and every dollar helps if anybody wants to contribute anything. Facebook, of course. Oh God, I don't do Instagram. I can't handle all these social media platforms.
Yeah.
Mint Press News. I'll be working with Whitney over the next couple of weeks, as I said. UK column, various websites, but mostly my Patreon account is my main publication area.
Awesome. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Slow News Day. I will be back at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central with the Free Assange Vigil. Nozomi Hayase is going to be on tonight. She's so awesome. And she has a fantastic article that came out last week in Anti-War. You should go read it. It's what we're going to be discussing tonight, so it's better if you study up before you come into the conversation. Let's see. Tomorrow, Danny Sherson and Ryan from the Last American Vagabond.
Yay! I love Ryan.
So yeah, make sure you're there for that.